Imagine Europe waking up after a long sleep. That's essentially what happened between the 14th and 17th centuries. This era, stretching from around 1300 to 1600, brought two world-changing movements. The Renaissance, a spectacular cultural and artistic rebirth, and the Reformation, a shattering religious revolution. Together, they demolished the foundations of the medieval world and ushered in the beginning of the modern era, creating the blueprint for much of our current culture and politics. The word Renaissance is French for rebirth, and that's exactly what it was, a rediscovery and revitalization of the ideas, art, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. During the Middle Ages, the focus was almost entirely on God and the afterlife. The Renaissance changed that, shifting attention to human beings, their potential, their achievements, and their life on earth. Scholars began to study classical texts, not just for religious meaning, but for their secular wisdom and perspective on being human. Why did this incredible rebirth begin in Italy? First, geography gave it an advantage. Italy was scattered with the ancient ruins of the Roman Empire, which served as constant inspiration. Second, and more importantly, Italian city-states like Florence and Venice grew incredibly wealthy from trade established during the Crusades. This wealth was concentrated in the hands of merchant families, such as the powerful Medici family of Florence, who had the money and desire to fund glorious art and architecture. These rich patrons made the Renaissance possible. The driving intellectual force behind the Renaissance was humanism. This wasn't a rejection of religion, but a shift in focus. Humanists believed that humans were fundamentally good and capable of achievement. They emphasized studying liberal arts, history, literature, and philosophy to better understand human nature and the world. Instead of simply accepting the Church's views on the afterlife, humanism encouraged critical thinking, civic virtue, and making life on earth meaningful. The system of patronage was the engine of Renaissance art. A patron is simply someone who financially supports an artist. Without wealthy patrons, whether they were merchant families like the Medici, kings, or even the Pope, artists would have had to work as common laborers. Patronage allowed artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo to focus entirely on perfecting their craft, leading to an explosion of artistic genius. It turned art into a competitive, high-status endeavor. When we think of the ideal Renaissance figure, we think of Leonardo da Vinci. He wasn't just a painter of masterpieces like the Mona Lisa. He was a true polymath, or Renaissance man. He excelled in countless fields, sketching detailed anatomical studies based on dissection, designing flying machines, and developing military technology. His genius came from the humanist ideal, using intense observation and reason to master every area of human knowledge. The artist who perhaps most mastered the human form was Michelangelo. He worked in Rome and Florence, often under the patronage of the Pope. You can see his mastery in the towering, heroic sculpture of David, which perfectly captures the ideal, powerful human physique. But his most massive undertaking was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where he spent years on his back, creating iconic biblical scenes that remain one of the most sublime artistic achievements in history. The Renaissance eventually traveled north, carried by merchants and students returning home from Italy. In Northern Europe, places like France, the Netherlands, and England, the emphasis was slightly different. Northern humanism was often more focused on religious sincerity and reform. Scholars like the great Erasmus used humanist techniques to study the Bible and early Christian writings, advocating for a simpler, purer form of Christianity and often criticizing the Church's corrupt practices. The widespread sharing of these new ideas wouldn't have been possible without one single invention: Johann Gutenberg's movable type printing press around 1440. Before this, books were copied by hand, a long, costly process. The printing press made books cheap, fast to produce, and widely available. This led to a huge leap in literacy and ensured that ideas, both artistic and controversial, spread like wildfire across Europe, forever changing education and communication. The groundwork for the Reformation was laid by centuries of growing discontent with the Catholic Church. The Church had become incredibly powerful and wealthy, which led to widespread corruption. People were particularly enraged by the sale of indulgences, documents that were essentially sold as a means to reduce the time a soul would spend in purgatory. Many felt the Church had strayed from its spiritual purpose, becoming too political and materialistic. The catalyst for the Reformation was a German monk named Martin Luther. He wasn't trying to break up the Church, he was trying to fix it. His major protest came in 1517, when he reportedly posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church. These were 95 arguments against the sale of indulgences and against the idea that the Pope could grant salvation. This single act of protest was a political and religious earthquake. Luther's challenge was not just about corruption, it was about theology. His core beliefs were revolutionary for the time. First, justification by faith alone, sola fide, meant that salvation came only through faith in God, not through good works or buying indulgences. Second, Scripture alone, sola scriptura, meant that the Bible, not the Pope or church tradition, was the final authority for Christian life. By giving individuals the right to interpret the Bible, Luther laid the intellectual groundwork for individual freedom and conscience. The Church responded quickly. In 1521, Luther was summoned before the Holy Roman Emperor at the Diet of Worms and declared a heretic and an outlaw. However, he was protected by powerful German princes who saw this as an opportunity to challenge the Pope's authority and seize church lands. These princes and their followers became known as Protestants because they were protesting against the Church's authority. The printing press ensured Luther's message reached the masses, and the religious division of Europe was underway. While Luther's movement took root in Germany, the Reformation expanded dramatically with the work of John Calvin in Switzerland. Calvin had an even stricter view of God's sovereignty. His key doctrine was predestination, the belief that God has already determined before time who will be saved and who will be condemned. Calvin's followers created a deeply disciplined moral community in Geneva, establishing a theocracy and spreading a powerful work ethic that would later influence many parts of Northern Europe and North America. The Reformation in England was perhaps the most political. It began because King Henry VIII desperately wanted a male heir and needed the Pope to annul his marriage, which the Pope refused to do. Rather than accept the Pope's authority, Henry decided to solve the problem himself. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, which effectively severed England from the Catholic Church and made the English monarch the supreme head of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. The Catholic Church was not passive. It launched its own vigorous internal reform known as the Counter-Reformation. The most important event was the Council of Trent, a series of meetings over 18 years. Here, the Church reaffirmed core Catholic doctrines that the Protestants had challenged, like the role of good works and the authority of the Pope. But it also addressed the corruption problem by outlawing the sale of indulgences and stressing the need for better educated priests. A major force of the Counter-Reformation was the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits acted as the Pope's shock troops, focusing on three main goals: creating excellent schools to educate the next generation, missionary work to convert people across the globe, and combating Protestant heresy in Europe. They quickly became the most effective organization in preventing the further spread of Protestantism. The religious division of Europe, inevitably led to decades of devastating conflict. Rulers had to choose between Catholicism and Protestantism, and that choice often led to war, like the bloody French Wars of Religion and the vast, destructive 30 Years' War. These wars were complex, blending religious motives with political power struggles. They only ended when rulers reluctantly accepted the principle of religious tolerance for neighboring states, recognizing that religious uniformity was impossible. One of the most profound political effects of the Reformation was the rise of the nation-state. By challenging the Pope's authority, Protestant rulers were able to consolidate their own power. They took control of church lands and made themselves the supreme authority in all matters, religious and secular. This transfer of authority weakened the concept of a unified Christendom under the Pope and created the framework for the powerful, independent, and centralized nations we recognize today. In the end, both the Renaissance and the Reformation left indelible marks on Western civilization. The Renaissance gave us the humanist emphasis on the individual, which fueled everything from modern art to the scientific revolution. The Reformation shattered Europe's religious unity, but by forcing individuals to confront ultimate questions of faith, planted seeds of individual conscience and arguably democratic thought. These twin movements closed the chapter on the Middle Ages and completely redirected the course of human history.